Heyo, Duckies and Dice fans, and oh my goodness, welcome in DM Jazzy Hands and your Raiders. Thank you so much for bringing over your community. We are here with the incredible Stefan, UmbralKnightX, and we're going to talk all things from TTRPGs to maybe even current events, maybe in some politics. We're going to get spicy up in here. But before we do that, hi, welcome. We are Chaotic Wholesome Presents. I'm Kay. This is David is this side. David, this is David, my co-host. We run the Tuesday table talk show where we do all things TTRPGs from indies to intersectionality. And this week, it's a little bit later. Thursday, Friday, we're going to be streaming Baldur's Gate 3 here. It is David and I's first playthrough. We are doing the entire thing on stream, and we are playing characters from our home game, so it gets pretty heckin' wild. But before we jump in and introduce our guest, David, who the heck is you, and what the heck is we doing here?
Hi, I need to do inventory management and housekeeping off screen for Baldur's Gate 3 because that's not fun at all.
Thank you so much, Herb, for the raid and bringing in all. Everyone is here. Thank you all so much. David, who the heck is you and what the heck is we doing here?
Hi, I am throwing it back for Santa. And this is the Chaotic Wholesome Presents Table Talk Show, where every week we talk about TTRPG stuff, how to be a better player, how to be a better GM, how to be a better person, how awesome Eugenio and Herb are, all with a focus on intersectionality and inclusivity so that everybody can have a good time.
It is perfect that this is the day you both raid, because I spent this afternoon working on our Magnificent Pride game, editing that up so we can get some short form content up for that. Thank you, Mediocre Bard, for the follow. You are not mediocre to me. But we are not here to talk about us today. We are here with a very special guest. So, Stefan, who is you? And what do you do?
Me? Yeah. So I am Stefan, and I am, or Stefan. Either one works. I accept both because the Creole side of the family says Stefan, and so I'm perfectly fine with either. I am a professor of history, and I specialize in histories of pop culture, film, television, tabletop role-playing games, and I also do histories of marginalized groups all throughout time, and getting into some wild areas. So in my history program, rather than doing one large thesis, they had us do 3 smaller theses that we had to do. And so the 3 that I did, the first one was on the Port Chicago disaster and the mass mutinies of trials of African Americans and the treatment of African Americans during World War II, and how the Black press engaged the Black community in discussing that. My second one was on 2 13th century tales of Black Arthurian knights, and that most people don't know about today as Knights of Arthur.
There were no Black people in medieval Europe.
Oh,
everyone knows that. No one of color existed then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course. Yeah, and then the last one I did was on race and gender in early tabletop role-playing games. And so I've been playing tabletop role-playing games since 1977, playing and running. And so I wanted to go back with an academic eye and look at the early history of tabletop role-playing games. So that's who I am. And so, and then you'll find me on Twitter at UmbralKnightX, Umbral_KnightX, and you'll find me musing on political issues, current issues, tabletop role-playing games, and things as they relate to race and gender and all those fun sort of things. And you mentioned intersectionality. The question to the class is if people know the origins of that term and its roots in the beginnings of the 3 most feared letters in the English language, CR.
Oh. It's funny because my first thought was I was like, "Oh, are you going to say DEI?" No, they're even more feared.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
call me a slur. Don't
Right.
like I'm
Right?
so tired of the people being like, "Oh,
Yes.
well, anyway." But no, I do not know the origin. So please enlighten me because
Yeah.
I was recently watching something about CRT and it went into like this was the origin of intersectionality. And I'm like, awesome. I learned a thing and now it's gone. Like you're like, what is it? And I'm like, I
Yeah.
know this.
So if you watch, and I will give a shout out to Legal Kimchi
Yes.
over on YouTube. He has a wonderful, wonderful, amazingly well-researched video on critical race theory, where he discusses this very topic. But in a nutshell, in a very brief nutshell, people get what CRT is and what intersectionality are wrong all the time. Um, Ultimately, in a very brief sense, CRT was a group of various scholars, law scholars specifically, legal scholars, who wanted to dissect certain things. So, like segregation and legal cases in the United States. And where we get the term intersectionality from is from a Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw when she basically is examining two cases in 1976. The first one is DeGraff and Reed versus General Motors. The second one is a case called Payne versus Tavernall. And in the first case, a group of women, Black women specifically, were suing General Motors, saying that General Motors discriminated against them in hiring practices and promotion practices. And so General Motors' response was to demonstrate through its attorneys that it had not discriminated against Black men, and it had also not discriminated against white women. Therefore, it could not be discriminated against Black women because it didn't discriminate against Black people, didn't discriminate against women. And so the court ruled in that particular case that Black women were not a separate class, and therefore General Motors was not discriminating against women. In the case of Payne versus Tavernall, you had a group of Black women again making a lawsuit, and they wanted to roll Black men into their lawsuit in that case. However, a different court ruled that they could not roll Black men into their case because Black women were a distinct class. So you can see that in 1976, we have these two conflicting rulings that come out. And so Kimberly Crenshaw is looking at these two cases, and she's basically in kind of very dense legal language saying, what the fuck? And she basically then coins this term that you hear today, intersectionality, to talk about when you have two marginalized categories and where they intersect creates a new category, two or more, and it creates a new category, right? And this is this concept of intersectionality that a lot of people talk about. But what CRT was doing in that particular case was trying to say, okay, well, wait a minute. How come when it comes down to this particular issue of race, critical race theory, do we have these two very different rulings from the American court system, right? And what CRT is really about is a legal framework to question and interrogate what is going on in the legal system when it comes to race, and saying, hey, what's going on here? Why these differences, and what should we attribute that to? What questions should we be asking, and what can we do about it? It is not trying to teach your children to be ashamed to be American. It is not trying to do all of these things that many people claim that CRT is designed to know. What it is it's discussing matters of history. And then maybe you might feel a little something when we talk about some of these awful things that had happened in the past. That's called empathy, people. and we hope that human beings have some of that, because when they don't, really bad things happen.
Yes.
Yeah. What's the tweet? I don't know how to explain to you that you should care about other people.
Yeah.
But,
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Thank you, Planetary Pan, for the follow. And then Mediocre Bard asks, were those rulings from the same or different court?
Those were from different courts. Yeah. As we can see, the court system, and it still happens today, right? We get very different rulings from the court. And the root of what Kimberly Crenshaw was doing was like looking at those cases and then trying to find out, okay, why did these different courts come to those rulings? What were their justifications, and what impact did that happen? Obviously, it's not new that courts in the United States have different rulings. That's been with us since the beginning.
Since 1781.
Yeah. That's been a very early thing. We can go back even to those early periods of American jurisprudence, and we get very different rulings, and we get constantly shifting rulings, right? We get that period very early on in the United States where we start to develop where we are now, and we start to see the language shift, in the early United States, in that very time frame you just mentioned in the late 1700s, where we shift from talking about people as European or Scot, and we start talking very specifically about them as white. We see the first origins of that language in 1791 comes out. White becomes the new language that's used in rulings, and other things that aren't new, right? That we see reflections of today, right? We have our lovely law in Texas that tries to pay bounties to people if they report those. They can basically sue someone for getting an abortion, and that's not new because in the early United States, we have documentation that demonstrates that you could report someone who was in a engaged in miscegenation or an interracial relationship, and there was a bounty paid, and that bounty was divvied up into thirds. 1/3 was paid to essentially the quote unquote the state, and 1/3 would be paid to the church, and 1/3 to the person who dropped the dime. So it's very American.
One thing that particularly irritates me about the discourse about CRT, and I understand that anything that certain interested parties who are trying to advance an agenda will latch on to whatever language, whatever branch, whatever thing they can get their claws into. But what irritates me is that CRT is a matter of scholarly research.
Yeah.
It is for the experts, for the scholars, to discuss and break down and advance research on.
Yes.
Not anything and I understand that I am a commoner, that I am one of the peasantry. But there are so many scholarly things, so many things done by educated experts that are not for me. That I don't have the tools to understand. And now, we could get a mathematician with autism in front of a board scribbling a bunch of things that aren't numbers over all of the walls, and I would sit there and go, oh my god, what could this possibly be? And they go, well, this isn't for you, this is for the 7 other people on Earth who are researching this very specific thing. And it's the same thing with history, it's the same thing with law. There are some really esoteric discussions that are happening that aren't for the general public.
This is where the nuance is so important, and of course is completely lost in a lot of public discourse, is that Yeah, CRT is quite literally a graduate level legal framework, right? This is something that you are going to learn in law school, right? You're not going to learn this in Adams Elementary or wherever the heck, right?
But it's
like
what
you're
they're teaching our first graders so that they'll
exactly.
hate themselves.
DS 138 ain't teaching CRT.
No, now the products of some of the things that have come out of CRT you might find in some K through 12 curriculum, right? Some of the products that have come out of that and the questions that have been asked, you might find, but you're not going to find actual CRT in a K through 12. Not even in an undergrad college classroom are you going to find them actually delving into CRT. Again, the products of CRT, absolutely, but not CRT itself. Like, you're going to be going to a graduate level law school, maybe a graduate level history program, something like that, where you're going to be talking about elements of this framework. But of course, it's an easy buzzword, and it's, we love acronyms, and it's easy to attach a set of ideologies to it and then use those to whip a particular base into a feather that's already predisposed to being upset about these things.
Right.
You can just throw a little bit more gasoline on the fire. So, there we are with that fun. But I always love to throw that out there when I hear people bring up intersectionality. So
yeah, like as you're doing, I'm like, oh yeah, it was the two different legal cases. That's right.
But like I said, for depth, if people want depth, totally, absolutely go check out Legal Kimchi's. His channel in general is phenomenal.
Channel is great.
Check out that video by him, and his most recent one on which does a beautiful job of
the YouTubers.
Yeah, and how people process information and how we process what we're supposedly learning from people on the internet. And he includes himself in that, as I include myself in that. Yeah. Verify people.
I have been a community manager since before Facebook existed, which, we are community ambassadors, but we're also part of the marketing team. We're also part of the comms team. We do a lot of like PR stuff, and I know those tricks real well. Yeah. Because when you're trying to not have a bunch of angry gamers blow up and scream at you, pick your words real carefully.
Look, we are still living in Edward Bernays' world. And if people don't know who Edward Bernays is, I highly recommend go look that dude up, because he writes the handbook on public relations and propaganda in the 1920s. And he becomes the guy right now. If you are watching political rallies, if you're watching the Republican National Convention, if you're watching the Democratic National Convention, if you're watching any sort of advertising, you are quite literally watching Edward Bernays at work, right? Like in the early to mid 20th century, he becomes the guy who crafts what is still used today to influence people, and he lays out the guidebook, so much so that not only do politicians to this day use him, the CIA use Edward Bernays to help overthrow Guatemala, all in the name of what used to be the United Fruit Company, but today is Chiquita Banana, can grow more bananas in Guatemala.
I was just gonna say, I was like, so we can have more bananas.
Yeah, absolutely, that's exactly it. And then
so we could wipe out the bananas that actually taste good.
If you see a woman smoking, you can blame a huge part of that on Edward Bernays, because prior to his ad campaign, women didn't smoke in large numbers. It was unladylike. And the tobacco companies are like, hey, bro, can you give it? We're like half the population we're missing out on here. And his ad campaign, masterfully, if you want to, put it in that term, but it's effective. He associates smoking with making Women Slim, with
Fun
weight
fact.
loss.
He I forget, he either forbade his wife from smoking, or whenever she smoked he got really angry at her, but he
Yeah.
had a problem with his wife smoking,
Yeah,
which wild.
yeah, Edward Bernays, like totally a case of do as I say and not as I do, because he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that smoking was not a good thing. He knew all of these things he was doing, but he knew how to manipulate people, and so
Yep.
scary guy. And like I said, to this day, his techniques are still used to influence all of us.
So
Yeah.
I'm excited because I like to think of myself as pretty well educated on a lot of topics that aren't mathematics, because I'm bad at math, but about as educated as a layperson can get. But we have an actual expert, an actual historian, and when I think about TTRPGs, my experience with TTRPGs between 1998 and like 2017 was me sitting around with a beat up copy of the second edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and a couple of weird white guys, and we hung out and we did the thing, but the rest of the context around it is lost on me, because every time I walked by a gaming store, there were a bunch of white dudes, some of them unwashed, where I'd look in, I'd be like, they're not gonna let me in this smoking club. I'm not allowed.
Right.
Like if I set foot in this pool, they will drain it and wash it. Like, so as a historian and someone who specializes in TTRPG history, like, give us some lesser known tidbits about TTRPGs through the different eras, because there have been different eras of TTRPGs.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what I did initially, when I wrote my first thesis on tabletop role, was I started looking at it through the lens of race, because that was my experience largely in, starting play in the late 70s and through the 80s, was that the overwhelming majority of TTRPG, and I wanted to go back and kind of examine that. And then as I started to, it really started to become apparent to me that I needed to add gender to that, because of course, very early on, the overwhelming majority of players were also male. And so it's really, really hard, because there are no hard demographics. It's not like there were a great many polls, and when they were, the polls were very small scale. In all my research, you can find an occasional poll in some of the magazines. So like Space Gamer, Fantasy Gamer, that was put out by Steve Jackson Games for years and years and years, at one point had a small poll. And I think the respondents were in the hundreds, right? Like, we're talking about a niche thing, even to this day.
A niche within a niche.
A niche within a niche, right? And so most of what we have data-wise is we have visual data. So we can go back and we can look at pictures and video of gaming conventions, large gaming conventions like Gen Con and several others, and we can look and see who's in attendance in those videos, right? And it is, John Peterson, who wrote the book Playing at the World, which is a massive, like, almost 700-page tome that traces the history of tabletop role-playing games, going all the way back to like roots in chess. He details in there that demographics for tabletop role-playing games in the early years are white male middle class, and that's everything my research pointed to, very much so. And so what I ended up looking at was a lot of the early role-playing games in the first several years of the hobby. And then I picked Dragon Magazine because Dragon Magazine was, of course, the kind of premier trade magazine of tabletop role-playing games. So I literally went through and I looked at Dungeons and Dragons, Traveler, uh, uh, Tunnels and Trolls, several other early games, Gamma World, and all of those, Roll Master, and many others. And then I looked at all of games I was familiar with because I had played all these games early on. But I also looked at Dragon Magazine and I went through every single issue for the first 10 years of Dragon Magazine. And I'm like, as part of my research, and what I wanted to look at was the treatment of race in these things. I wanted to look at the treatment of gender. I know it will be a shock that it's not good.
No.
People of color are largely absent, except for certain blips where we get things like Oriental Adventures coming along.
Which was so well done.
Yeah, well, the 80s were a particular animal.
Mhm.
and then also we had this the overwhelming majority of people of color, actually, interestingly enough, in this time frame, we had the Marvel role-playing game. In the Marvel role-playing game, one of the things they would do in Dragon Magazine, they had a section within Dragon Magazine called Ares, and that particular section dealt with because of course the majority of stuff in Dragon Magazine dealt with shocking, because it was published by TSR, with Dungeons and Dragons, right? But in this Ares section, they dealt with their non-Dungeons and Dragons game, their sci-fi stuff, Star Frontiers and the Marvel role-playing game. The overwhelming majority of people of color that you find in the first 10 years of Dragon Magazine are in that section, because what it is it's them statting out characters from Marvel comic books. So it's Black Panther and Falcon and all of these characters being statted out for the Marvel role-playing game in these books. And that's where you find the majority of people of color. You do find a few other instances outside of that, but again, they're not favorable. They are very kind of very tropish images of, there's one that comes to mind where you have a white character who's wearing very traditional kind of European style garb, where he's got on a helm and he's got on armor and a sword, and standing next to him, you've got a black character who is in leopard skins holding a spear.
Yikes.
That sort of thing.
Yikes.
Yeah. And that was a lot of the presentation. There are a couple of exceptions to this. One of them is a very brief little section that's actually written by a Black science fiction author. But other than a couple of exceptions, that's what you're going to get in the early years. For women, not much better. Repeatedly, the ever popular chainmail bikini and the boob armor and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, the bikini of invincibility.
Yeah, and then I find a couple of interesting discussions about the placement of women in the game setting. But largely these pieces are written by men. One of them is trigger warning for sexual assault. One of them is particularly about sexual assault and its prevalence in, of course, they're using the R word, its prevalence in TTRPGs, because in the late 1970s, a man by the name of Gary Allen Fine, who was a sociologist, he did the first ethnography of tabletop role playing, where he basically joined several role playing groups, and just kind of took notes and studied what they were doing. Several clubs and groups around. And one of the things he talks about, he wrote a book on it called Shared Fantasy. And one of the things he wrote about was that he wrote about the overwhelming prevalence in across these groups and in multiple different role-playing games of sexual assault by the predominantly male gamers. It was just like a very nonchalant thing, and then so there's a response in Dragon Magazine, not directly to that, but basically saying that, hey, this is something that doesn't have any place in tabletop role-playing games, and the fact that Dragon Magazine was addressing it kind of says to me that they thought that there was a wider issue, right? And that but then it goes on to, in the very kind of 80s fashion, it goes on to do some very weird things. Like, for example, it gives these suggestions for like encounters you might have with ladies of the night on the street, and it gives suggestions that you find not only in this game but in other early games like Ardering Grimoire, and things like that have these tables that like whether or not a woman is going to get pregnant if she has a sexual encounter during a role-playing game. Please note that you will not find any comparable tables as to whether or not a man can get it up.
Yeah.
But, we're, again, a lot of like very, very like schmarmy stuff. And then there's an article in, I want to say, the 3rd issue of Dragon Magazine, and it is Notes on Women and Magic, bringing the distaff gamer into Dungeons and Dragons. Distaff being an ancient term, for those who don't recognize it, for women. Distaff, get it? Yeah.
Wait.
Yeah.
You just broke David.
Yeah.
So 2 things. One,
Yeah.
whatever table they had about pregnancy is inaccurate. Because today I go on the internet every day, and there's always like 4 days a week, some woman going, hey, this dude thought that like my period was like optional, that I choose to have it every month. Other ridiculous thing where you don't
absolutely.
Even. Let's talk about the straight male heroes of the post-Roe era who have their birth. They've downloaded a tracking app, a period tracking app, a fertility app.
Yeah,
gosh, yes.
And guess, like, yeah, I think the period would happen now just to mess with the data, to make it harder.
I got mine bi-monthly.
Oh yeah.
I'm bleeding all the time.
It's I'm like, you have no idea what you're doing, and you are using it for good, and thank you.
And this comes out of like in the 80s, in the late 70s and early 80s, early role-playing games were very, very big. A lot of them were very, very big, and you can go and pick up like a copy of the first edition Advanced Dungeon Master's Guide, or any of the games of that era. And one of the things that developers were trying to do at that time was come up with a rule for everything. And so you could find some of the oddest tables for some of the strangest things in early role-playing games where you're like, why are we even like, but there it is. Like, and literally, in Ardering Grimoire, and in this thing, there are these like, it's a suggestion in this article, but the table actually exists in Ardering Grimoire, which, for people who don't know, was kind of an early offshoot of D&D. And it's like, say what now?
So one, they're wrong. Whatever table, wrong.
Oh yeah, 2, absolutely.
They used a slur in the title. Look, for people who don't know, I don't use them, but I take great pleasure in discovering like the ancient, like unearthing old timey racial slurs. I love them.
Yeah.
They're awful, they're terrible, but I find them hilarious. And this staff, when I tell you that I hadn't heard that,
and now I'm gonna hear it all the time.
Man, so much.
It was a standard term for women for a very long time. Just a general term that was used. And of course, they're trying to insert a little bit of wit into this article, which then goes on to introduce what eventually will develop later on into the comeliness score in later versions of D&D. But it's beauty, the beauty score, they call it in this version, and for female characters. And then it goes on to give certain abilities based on your beauty score. So for instance, only ugly women could use, who had a of course, the D&D standard, right? You have your your midsection there of like 9 to 12, that's average. And then if you're above or below that, right? If you're below that, you're ugly, and only ugly women can use the horrid beauty spell. And only beautiful women can use the seduction spell. Yeah.
And finally, and most importantly, men writing articles about women and explaining women to men. It is quintessential blind leading the blind.
Yeah.
Because not just men, but TTRPG nerds in the 80s telling other TTRPG nerds about women.
Yeah.
Not a bar of soap in sight.
Well, and here's a fun thing. Like, of course, you always hear people talk a lot about all of this stuff is new, right? People weren't talking about these things. And then you go into the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, and right there in black and white, Gary Gygax writes down, he says that he does not like the term free people or gentle beings. And he essentially discounts those terms because they're gender neutral, and that the gendered language is the standard, right? Which, the first edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide comes out in 79, and that's right there. So you can't tell me that, this is new. People weren't having those conversations. Obviously they were, because he took the time to say, I reject those terms, right?
So
it's like
a little bit of a peek behind a curtain without pointing any fingers or say anything. David and I were approached by a D&D Kickstarter. That was, they were like, hey, we're looking to sponsor some channels to get the word out about our upcoming Kickstarter project. And we looked into them a little bit, and they made beautiful products, high quality. The art was on point. They'd had several successful Kickstarters. So we're like, cool, let's talk about this. But when we get on the call, it was all about celebrating Gary Gygax and celebrating the good old days. And this is going to be a callback to the good old days. And when D&D was da-da-da-da. And so I'm kind of like, Dave and I are both like, and they're doing...
Full disclosure, I know exactly who you're talking about. And I personally know the owner. They're right. That company that you're talking about is right here in Colorado Springs. And I happen to know the owner.
I hate him so much. Anyway,
they did a full hardcore press presentation to us, right?
Absolutely.
And we're just like,
yeah.
And also, how are you going to come to us and ask us for something and be condescending the whole time?
Yeah.
So we get to like the point where they're like, what do you think? And I'm like, okay, so I would kind of like to address the elephant in the room.
Right.
The good old days of D&D weren't good old days for people who look like David and I.
Right.
And the immediate response was, you shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You shouldn't judge all of this because it was like those were different times back then. This was, as far as I know, Gary Gygax was a very nice person, and I'm like, I'm sure he was if you looked you. He was not a very nice person to people who look like me.
Right. Yeah, I know exactly. I know the company and the individual you're talking about very well. I've actually even done some work for them myself.
Other project maybe, but I was like, this is not the project for our community.
Their setting, which I've done work for, because they and again, being fully upfront and fully disclosing, they are working on a setting that is centered on Africa, as an analog of Africa. So they came to me as a consultant on that, and that's still in process. So we will see how that
how's it, is it
good so far.
Okay, good.
Because we've had many people who like behind closed doors through whisper channels, like, hey, I was hired to be a like sensitivity reader on this, and they're like, oh, it's done already, we're just having you read this so that we can say that you read it.
It is definitely not done. It is still in process.
That's good.
And I am hopefully this will remain the case. I am intimately involved in it, in the building and the process of it.
Steer them in the right direction. Yell at the right people.
Absolutely.
We did also get the lecture on why he built racism into that world, and I'm like,
yes,
great.
Yes. I've had that conversation with him, and I am so that's one where I am of a particular mind, because I think there can be a utility there if it's done correctly. And I've had a lot of conversations with the owner of that particular company ultimately, because like I said, I know him fairly well. I will say this again, without naming any names. I will say this. It's a work in progress. He's coming along.
To steal a phrase from another D&D personality, like David and I do definitely to a certain extent grade on a sliding scale, right? Like yes, there was racism and there was sexism in early D&D, and we're not going to delete that. We're not going to pretend that wasn't there.
Right.
But we do look back on certain things and go, okay, that is not cool. We do not approve of that. That was also socially acceptable at the time.
100%.
You know, I grew up in an era when you called people gay on the playground, and that was normal and fine, and that is not the world anymore. And no, that was never normal and fine. It should never have been, but that was just the world.
It's almost as if language grows and changes over time. And so my favorite thing about the sliding scale is, and like, you know, looking at history, and I'm sure you've experienced this way more than I have, is all the people who are trying to justify the racism and slavery and all the other like terrible things that happened in the past by going, oh, well, it was just normal at the time, completely ignoring that at every stage in every country there was a movement to stop the horrible things that were happening. They were
absolutely.
Like for one, the slaves weren't happy about it.
Right.
And there were abolitionist movements. Look, we're not talking about Kanye, okay?
If you watch certain films, they'll say the slaves were perfect.
Gone with the Wind.
No, they were so. I grew up in the South. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
They were basically family.
If you watch the movie Gods and Generals, for example, and if you watch the director's cut of that, that's nearly 5 hours of your life you're not ever going to get back. The black people who appear in it are supportive of what's going on, and they're happy. Confederacy is doing its thing, but exactly.
So very quickly, my favorite little sort of like little capsule of sliding scale is H.P. Lovecraft.
Sure.
Because in like the 19 teens and the 1920s, obviously everybody was racist against black people because this is the United States. So when the people who knew him were like, yo, you need to tone the racism down. How racist do you have to be when the racists are saying you're going too far?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I also want to very just quickly just point out too, like, we live in an era when people love to scream about cancel culture.
Yeah.
And I am very much of the belief that, yes, there are people that we need to deplatform. If they are actively hurting people, we deplatform them. But someone make a mistake or having a bad take and learning and growing, okay, maybe they don't get to be on the front page. You know, maybe we don't retweet them for a while, but someone doing one thing wrong, one little not knowing how. Raise your hand if you've never used an ableist term or a term that was common but had racist roots. If you've ever used cakewalk, you're guilty of it, right? We don't attack people for that. We correct them. And if they learn and move forward, we let them learn and move forward. And so I just want to circle back with, you know, this person, again, Dave and I were like, this project is not for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we're not out here going, heck, this person, they are fill in the blank.
Right.
Because, again, while they had a strong stance of what we're doing is this is totally fine, and we're like, cool, it's not totally fine for us.
Yeah.
They're learning. They're growing.
Look,
and it is a process. People don't wake up overnight and know.
I think there's a couple of things there, right? Like, you're absolutely right that, like, you know, the guidepost for me is, are we talking about an incident or a trend? Right? If we can see a pattern of behavior and it's bad behavior as a pattern, then we've got a problem, right? The other thing is that, like, you know, look, I'll be right there in line to call Gary Gygax out on various things, right? And I think a lot of that is warranted, right? But also, I've had the opportunity to briefly, not like to briefly have some discussions with Luke Gygax, who is not like his brother Ernie, because his brother Ernie, fuck that guy.
Ooh.
Yeah. Luke seems very chill. I've never met him.
To have some, to talk to him and to talk to, at a con, he and his daughter were at the booth across from us. And I also, you know, want to put out there that Gary Gygax, for whatever his faults, was that guy's dad, and he was that girl's granddad. He was a human being. He was a flawed human being, and you know, we can cast stones all day, but Luke Gygax, who, again, I've only spoken to him briefly, not in any in-depth thing, very much believes in the good things about the legacy of what his dad helped create. And wants to celebrate that. And I don't think he's wrong to do that. Because for whatever faults we can attribute to Gary Gygax, for whatever faults we can call out with Dungeons and Dragons, today it's being used in therapy. Today it's being used in all sorts of other things. And even then, as I was growing up, amidst the racism and the sexism and stuff in the hobby, I saw D&D also being put to great use. And so I think it's important to kind of take a pause sometimes and understand the nuance of, we're talking about human beings here. Yeah, we may be talking about human beings who did some things that weren't good that we need to call out. And we need to have those discussions. But I think it's also important to understand that there's some good that came out of that too, and that we should absolutely celebrate those good things and talk about those good things as well. the whole hobby as a whole, one of the key elements that I argued in my thesis was that what was happening in early tabletop role-playing games, that again, if we look at the demographic, middle class white male, um, these games kind of get their origins, as a lot of people know, and there's a lot of debate. People talk about chainmail, but there's also Bronsteins. If people haven't heard of those, go look them up. Um, there's Daniel Kwan actually wrote a great article on them. You look him up, you can find that article on Bronsteins. The these early precursors to what we call the role playing game. In those early games, that started to be kind of the ideas started to be generated in the late 1960s, come about in the early 1970s when we get D&D. And one of the things I argued is that what you had was a group of white middle class men whose world was fundamentally changing. You had the Vietnam War, you had the women's rights movement, you had the civil rights movement, you had all of these other things, and the world that they had grown up in, the world they had known, where they were, even if they couldn't articulate it, where they were the unquestioned, dominant animal, right, was being flipped on its ear, quite literally before their eyes, in so many ways, and in some very chaotic ways. Right, we see a lot of violence in the 1960s, a lot of violent protest. The Vietnam War is going on, and people are getting drafted, and some of them are not coming home, or they're coming home maimed, and all of this is like fundamentally changing. And one of the things that I constantly saw in my research was this repeated refrain, to one degree or another, that what role-playing games did was they gave them a world where they could fight the evils of the world. They could save the world from this chaos that was coming into it, and they could control this chaos. They could say, oh no, wait a minute. If you're dark, we're going to put you back here. If you're a woman, we're going to put you back in this role, right? And whether or not they did it consciously is not the point. The point is that now they were able to create these worlds where they were in control. And in some cases, you see this quite literally in action. So before Dungeons and Dragons, you had these things called APAs, or Amateur Press Association. And amateur press associations were something that existed throughout the middle of the 20th century, before, of course, long before the internet, where what would happen is you would join an APA, and then people would write articles about, and early on, before Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games, it was mostly about science fiction and fantasy books. And so people would write fan fiction, or they would write some kind of like pseudo-academic article about, like, why people were doing certain things in this story, or whatever the case may be. And then they would send those stories to what was called a compiler, and that compiler would then put them all together, run off copies, and mail them to all the people that were part of this amateur press association. And it got to the point that one of those in particular became so subsumed with D&D that they actually asked them to create their own thing, and that became Alarms and Excursions, which was actually run for a very long time by Lee Gold, who is one of the few women who was creating some of the foundational elements of Dungeons and Dragons in the early days, things on economic systems, and some of the things that we still have today, like the Iron Golem, come from women. And so these amateur press associations, one of the articles you find early on in there is an encounter, a scenario for an encounter. And quite literally, you have the primary encounter is a black dragon, and its minions are Viet Cong. But again, so I put all this together, and so the argument, one of the primary arguments I'm making is that part of what they were doing was they were crafting these worlds that allowed them to escape from the chaos of the world around, the world that was they were watching change in some very drastic ways in a really short period of time, historically speaking. And this gave them that, like, this place of control where they could say, hey, look, I can do these things. I can make the rules here, right? That I can't control in the world around me. And again, while there's a lot of ugliness that comes out of that, we also get a lot of good things too that come out of, like, the storytelling elements that come out of these, like, early points of the game. So yeah, I think it's, like, so critical to criticize and call out those negative things, but also to acknowledge the things that were done that put us where we are today, right?
So I think it's really fascinating that you mentioned that they played these games to control, because everyone I play with now and every discussion I've had with, it's always been about exploration. I sit down and like you know, with Q, with Body and Soul, like it was always the discussion of exploring how people would react in these times, how the gods would react in those times. I did a zero session over the weekend, and everyone was curious and interested in exploring not just the world, but their characters, and through their characters themselves. And that has been my experience in the space. Is not like it's not necessarily like slaying the big black guy at the end.
Yeah.
And the VC running around.
And it's super important to, I think, to acknowledge that in early role-playing games, and certainly, you know, when I'm speaking here, I'm speaking in some sort of, like, broad generalizations, right? This wasn't everyone that was playing games at the time, right? But it was considerably more popular in early tabletop role-playing games, particularly Dungeons and Dragons, that they were adversary, that you had a GM who was trying to kill you, and you kind of took and, like, playing, when I played, it was, for me, early on in my early years, like, I started playing in 77. I was 7 years old, and I came home with this box, and I grabbed a friend, and I was like, look, we're going to make these characters, and we're going to play this. And I didn't know what the I was doing. I was just going for it, right? And, you know, so, like, it's 1977, and I had lightsabers in my game because Star Wars had just come out, and I thought they were cool. I didn't know. I was just doing it, right? But, like, when I started to get into the wider scope of games, what I discovered was that, like, the standard was, in a lot of places, was that you were playing these games, and the GMs were throwing deadly monsters and traps, and you were trying to figure out how to survive it all. So it was like, you know, and I liken it, it was fucking tabletop Dark Souls. Like, you were trying to fucking grinder. It was a meat grinder, but the challenge and the fun was, could you survive it? Right? Like, could you outsmart what the GM was throwing at you in these games, right? And that's the way everything, it was like, again, and you had, like, very early on, like, you know, you go to, like, the early iterations of Gen Con, and it was all about tournaments, right? It was about you meeting certain goals within a scenario, and how many of you survived. Did you manage to capture these treasures? Did you manage to capture these things? It was a very, like, structured and regimented thing, and a point system, and the whole 9 yards, right? And that was the paradigm. So that was the approach that people came into a lot of games with, right? Was that it was a challenge, it was adversarial, and that you were trying these things in that way. And it's not until much later, when we get into, like, the 1990s, that we get, like, White Wolf games, right? White Wolf is hugely instrumental in doing two things. One, shifting the focus away from the system onto the story, and 2, bringing more women into the hobby. Huge impact that the White Wolf games, Vampire the Masquerade, Werewolf the Apocalypse, Changeling the Dreaming, all of those have a huge impact in making those particular changes. And they're not alone in that, but they're like they're the, you know, at that time frame, they're the biggest in making that kind of shift, right?
Yeah.
And that changes fundamentally, then I think sets the groundwork for what we see later into where we are now in games, where you have a lot more emphasis on cooperation, and you have a lot more emphasis, not to say that those other types of games don't still exist, because it's a growing macrocosm of things, right? We're not like completely eliminating necessarily those things. We're just adding new things to it, and maybe this over here becomes more popular, or this becomes more popular as we move on. And so you find a lot more cooperative stuff. You find a lot more rules light stuff than you did in this particular time period, where everything was codified, and, you know, most of the things were challenges. So, and that's kind of the framework that they were in, right? They were building these games in. And certainly, again, not everyone that was playing these games was in that mindset and doing these things. But, you know, I argued that it when you look at the early gamers and what they were talking about and what they were saying and how they were crafting games, they really were wanting to create things they control. And let's be honest, we're all doing that to some degree, right? We want to create worlds that look like what we want to see, right? And that's, you know, kind of what they were doing. And I argue that, like, this chaos is what they were responding to. To them, it was just like, what the heck is happening, right? From their perspective, you know, a lot of the early game development companies that you find, TSR, Game Developers Workshop, and all that stuff, are right there smack in Middle America, you know? So...
And it was really interesting coming into because I didn't start into the TTRPG scene until much later in my life, for multiple reasons, including, like, I grew up in the Bible Belt. Hey, Lady Luck. You know, Satanic Panic was very much a thing.
Yes.
There were not, you know, Christian schools, so no one played D&D. Like, I didn't have the opportunity. And talking especially to the straight white middle-aged dudes, you know, who played a lot in those eras, they were like, why didn't you just go to your local game store? And it's like, okay, so there's layers to that. Like, number one, Satanic Panic, I would have been expelled from school had I gone to those.
Right.
Number two, if high school me had walked into one of those stores, I would not have been welcome. And even if I had, like, and let me be clear, I'm gonna hashtag not all men, because this is not all men, and this is not even all white men, right, who do this. But
I'll say all
when
men.
a lot of you know, old school, middle-aged and older D&D dudes start recounting their stories of these early epic games, you know, and they were dungeon crawls. They were just slogs. You didn't start at the tavern. You started at the mouth of the dungeon.
Yep.
And they would go into great detail how they went through and they slaughtered everything. And it was a meat grinder. And at the end, they would get a gold and a princess, and they'd decide who got to marry the princess.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm like...
Gross.
So I am... Number one, the mindless slaughter, there's, you know, because it's usually, oh, we killed all of the orcs, and we all know, or we killed all the drow, and we all know, right? We all know.
Yes.
But then they go through all that, and they're like, and then we get a princess, and so-and-so got to marry her. Yeah. And that was the reward. And I'm like...
Have you ever seen the movie The Gamers?
Yes.
Have you seen the, I think it's in the second film. There's a great scene where one of the female gamers walks into a game store, and there's all these, and to this day, my wife talks about her experiences in game stores in the 80s, because she's been playing since the 80s. That very thing happening, right? Like that is like an actual, like, lived experience for a lot of female gamers in the early days who walk into a store and it's just like,
Yep.
And like, I don't deep K lore here. I used to be a working comic artist. I have done a cover. Like, I was a colorist. And even in the 90s, even in the early 2000s, I would walk into a game store, and they'd just be like, my artwork was on the shelves, right? They were selling books with my work in it, and they'd still be looking at me like,
yeah. I was fortunate in that for a good portion of the 80s, mid to late 80s, my go-to game store, my go-to game and TTRPG store was co-owned by a woman. So thankfully, that was not the experience there, because there were several other stores in Southern California where I grew up where that absolutely was the experience, both comic shops and game stores. And then for me as well, being a black guy walking into some of those places was, you know, a similar experience in many ways, because there were a lot of side eye and a lot of, you know, it was very much like the old trope of the Western, where the guy's playing the piano and everybody's like drinking, and then everything just stops, you know, and everybody like, you know, like I encountered that at more than a few game stores, you know, back in the day. Yeah.
I do not know what it is like to be black, but I do know what that experience is like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think if you're a part of like any like marginalized group where you have like a visible difference, there is definitely that experience of that time. You know, I still remember where I am now in Colorado. Before I went back into academia, I worked a job, and I had a coworker, and we had went to one of the small towns in Colorado, and he's an older white dude, and we walked into a restaurant in this small town in eastern Colorado, and it was literally that experience where everybody like stopped and like, you know, like looked at us as we walked into the front door of the restaurant, and he just like kind of like gets this really puzzled look on his face, and he's like he's like, is my fly open? Or like, he's like, and I'm like, I'm black, dude. And he's like, oh, he's like, oh, okay.
That's like the other interesting thing that I found. It's very difficult to explain to a certain demographic of gamer, is it's like, you know, when you are not welcome. You know when there is a sign on the door that might not be there, but you know when the sign on the door that says no blank, right? When you're, and it can be so difficult to explain. Like, I was trying to explain to one of these people, like, D&D kind of feels to me like watching a James Bond movie, right? Especially in the olden days. Like, it was like, I really want to be into this. There's some stuff that's really cool, but I have two roles here. I'm either an old woman who helps out, or I'm a femme fatale who's supposed to put out. And I'm not either of those, right? And I don't fit in this world, and I can make myself fit, but that is work. That is effort. And this person was like, I don't have to like fit into anything to be able to play. Like, you don't have to. And I'm like, okay, you just don't get it. And then it turned out years later, the Wonder Woman movie came out, and he was like, and look, I got issues with the Wonder Woman movie. Let me be very clear. It was not perfect, but like, he was like, yeah, I didn't like it. And like, we started drilling down, and it was just like, I don't know. It just didn't feel like there was a place for me there. And I'm like, you do get it. You do get it. This is your first time.
What? Yeah. I heard the same thing about people say the same thing about the Black Panther movie. But you know, I tell people all the time that it was not until, like I said, I started in 1977. It's not until the 90s that I played a character who looked like me. Because I grew up in an era where people who looked like me were the sidekick. People who looked like me were the thug. They were not the leader. They were not the main hero. They didn't lead the group. They were it was white news. And so, you know, almost without exception, on television, in movies, overwhelmingly it was, that's what I got, right? And so I like seriously internalized that until like I got older and I was like, hey, wait, what the, like, and yeah, that's hard for a lot of people to understand, because when you get up every morning and everybody in the media looks like you, and that's just the standard.
Yep. And
you don't
this
have
is
to
why
think
I
about
got
it.
no patience for the video game guys who were like, oh, this forced diversity. And I'm like, I'm sorry. I grew up feeling weird about the fact that I sometimes liked boys in video games because I was playing a boy, and I, as playing a boy, liked a boy in a video game, but that was bad according to my religion. I'm sorry you're uncomfortable.
Yeah,
that
right.
you have to play as a girl. I'm sorry.
Also,
Right,
there are
yeah,
other people, like a full half of the population is not like you.
Oh yeah,
And-
but that doesn't count.
Exactly. Only
But-
my experience counts.
Yeah.
Go, David.
Kay and I were having this conversation because there's the running joke of like, oh, you're queer. What color is your tiefling?
I'm not. No,
Right. just slings and arrows directly at Kay.
Yeah.
And we were
it's
talking.
not because I'm queer. It's because I like Nightcrawler. Okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Kurt. Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
but we were talking about characters, and I was like, oh man, I realize I play humans all the time. And Kay's like, yeah, you play humans all the time. And the stunning realization that hit me like a ton of bricks is I play humans all the time because I want to live the fantasy of being a normal person. I want to live the fantasy of being a full 100% human, not just 60% of a human.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's that. And I was just like, is this internalized racism? Like, what's, and it's just, and you know, like you said earlier, like we are all trying to control something when we play these games. And actually, one of the challenges that Kay and I have, and one of the challenges that I have had in world building, because we do tons of custom settings, is introducing conflict into those worlds, because we don't want to make a world that's broken. We don't want to make a world with racism and misogyny and transphobia and cruelty in general. We don't want to make a world with shitty people in it. Yeah. And then we end up making a world that looks like My Little Pony. And in some cases, literally My Little Pony. And then we got to find conflict somewhere.
Yeah. I tell people all the time, like, so for me, because I'm weird and I'm a historian, I craft my worlds, my default fantasy setting that I've run through several different systems for the last 20 years is really centered on ideas of racism and the legacy of slavery and whole nine yards. And it's like predicated on this idea that the elves and the dwarves enslaved goblins, humans, and orcs for thousands of years. And then the goblins, humans, and orcs rose up and overthrew their oppressors in the whole nine yards. And I'm like, for me, and I think that's one of the like key things. Like I'm like, look, I am never ever going to look at another marginalized person who says, I don't want racism or sexism or homophobia in my entertainment. Like I'm never going to get down on anybody for that. For me, worlds that are like that feel weird. I get this uncanny valley effect where I'm like, no, wait a minute.
There's something unreal.
Something's unreal here. Something's not right. Like, and it's always like pecking at the back of my head. But I'll never, like I said, I'll never put a marginalized person down who doesn't want to deal with those things, because like I totally get like wanting to not have to deal with that, wanting a place where you don't have to engage in those things and you can set that down for a little bit. I totally get that. And I also understand that like I feel I have the historical knowledge and the expertise to kind of deal with those things in my game and kind of use them as a tool.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are others who exist out there who do them quite well in some role-playing games, and use them as a tool. For example, Chris Spivey's Harlem Unbound, when you talk about H.P. Lovecraft, his Harlem Unbound takes this concept of the cosmic horror and rolls in these ideas of the Harlem Renaissance and what was going on in that time frame that we're talking about, and does a very effective job with it. And I think there are other examples out there as well. But also, I absolutely acknowledge that there are a crap ton of bad examples, and there are a crap ton of people who want to be able to just use these things for a titillation factor and like be able to like, throw these things in just for shock value.
Yeah. Or to vent their real world.
Or or to do it for some other awful purpose. And so I get that it is something that requires nuance and navigation, and things like that, and that you have to, if someone's going to do it, they damn well better have done their research, and damn well have done things with it. And I, like I said, there are multiple examples I can think of that are out there where it's been done well, and it's been done in a purpose that I think, because to me, our entertainment, be it science fiction and fantasy in particular, I think they are at their best when they are doing something to where they are embedding a lesson, where not everybody, because you're going to get those people that just are going to be, well, it's fantasy and it's not real and all that. And those people were asleep the day we went over allegory and metaphor and semiotics and
Yes.
and storytelling. They either skipped that day or they were asleep. But when we have those things, I think the best elements of fantasy and science fiction are when you get those people out there who are like, that's kind of silly. Why would someone discriminate against somebody just because they're green? And then the light bulb fucking goes on and they're like, oh, wait.
Yeah.
Hold on.
Yeah, like David runs a home game that may be coming back soon. Maybe.
No, that will definitely be coming back soon.
That
if I gotta drag all y'all kicking and screaming.
Deals with a lot of racism, right? And it is specifically racism against non-human people, right?
Yeah.
And I play a half-orc. And a world with racism run by a person of color is very different than a world with racism run by a white person.
Yeah.
I will jump into, if a person of color is like, this world has racism, you are going to be treated the way that I have been treated, you are going to learn. I'm like, cool.
Yeah.
This will be difficult. I want, this does not replace lived experience, but this will give me more insight, more understanding, more ability. This will be amazing. It will be terrible and it will be wonderful. And I want in.
Yeah.
If a white dude is like, running a game and all the orcs are slaves.
I will throw out one thing. You're not wrong at all, but I will throw out that it is an interesting experience if you ever have the opportunity. Because when we say that, we're talking largely about the United States and Western Europe.
Yes.
If you have ever had the opportunity, and I used to have a friend years ago, you've ever had the opportunity to have a game run by a white dude that comes from certain parts of Eastern Europe?
Yes.
Or you've had the opportunity to be in a game that's run by a white person who's spent years in, say, somewhere like Asia or something like that. It's a different experience. Yes. And if you ever have that opportunity, I highly suggest you take you take that up. I had a friend years ago who was from Slovakia, and whole different animal when a white dude who comes from that region runs a game involving racism, because obviously a different dynamic going on there. But
that was an American-centric statement of mine, which I should have.
No. I mean, also, you can include, like, the general like Western Europe in there too, because France and the UK and all of those very similar animals when it comes to some of those things. As the United States in many ways.
And that reminds me of a very important thing that I think is left out of a lot of discussions about prejudice, and that is access. Because I saw a statistic somewhere that's like only 20% of white people have a black friend. And if you look at the map of the United States, that makes sense. Because we're all clustered into a couple of places. And if you're from Wyoming, the one black guy who lives in the state can't be friends with everybody.
Right, yeah. That's a busy dude.
Right.
I grew up in Texas. I went to a private Christian school. We had 2 black kids in the entire school. They were siblings, and their last name was White.
Yeah, there you go.
And so, and it's the same thing with like, you hear people toss around like, oh, well, you should just go get therapy. And it's like, for one, do you know how much therapy costs? I was literally on the phone 2 nights ago, and a friend of mine was like, "Hey, my therapist is now out of network because of shenanigans, and it's going to be $400 an hour, so I can't go." And go book a therapist right now. I did some research for a couple of friends of mine who all needed therapy for one reason or another. And out of 3 different people that I was doing research for, I managed to find one therapist that had a booking within 3 months.
Yeah.
3 different people, 3 different insurances, 3 different networks.
Nearly 3 years to get into therapy in New York.
Look, if you go get a map of the United States, a political demographic map by county, broken down by county, and you take that map and you go get a map that is going to show you the by-county racial demographics of the United States. You put those maps side by side, and you're going to look at the quote-unquote, as we call them today, blue and the red areas, and then you are going to compare the demographics of POC. I don't think I need to tell a lot of people what you're going to see, right?
You're going to see the gerrymandering maps.
You're going to see gerrymandering. You're going to see that the majority of people of color are clustered in the cities, which are largely blue, and the rural areas, which are largely red. You're not going to find a large portion of POC demographics overall.
And Mark, watching on YouTube, he says the challenge of finding a therapist that aligns with what's going to be most helpful for you as a human being. Also, thank you for watching on YouTube. But like, if I, as a black man, am having like, if I just got my ass whooped again by a police officer, and I go get a therapist, and a 60-year-old white woman is sitting across from me, we're not going to cover a whole lot of ground. I'm not going to be able to connect with her. And that's not saying that she's not helpful, and that's not that she's not sensitive to it, but I'd have a lot easier time talking to a black guy across the table who has a at least a roughly similar background to me.
Yeah.
I had a therapist for close to half a year before I'm like, it was really awkward at this thing because people were very obviously, there was alcohol and people were very obviously hitting on me, trying to get me to go home. And not only, was I not there for that, I'm also ace. And she's like, oh my God, it didn't occur to me. You've got a minority like exhaustion there too, just from that.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
Look, if you are part of any marginalized group where there is a visible indicator of you being a part of that group, then you know the nod. You know the nod. You know when you see another person and you're like,
you're out in public and you look at each other and you're like,
Yeah. You're like,
Mhm.
yeah, okay. You know that because there are things that you do not have to explain to each other.
And
It's there.
like circling back to demographics and where certain people are positioned in the United States. My parents, my dad was born in 39. He was an adult when Ruby Bridges got walked into a school by the National Guard.
Yeah.
He was out of the military when integration was done. Um, and in discussions with him, he's like, "Oh no, like segregation never ended." Like, especially when it comes to education, he's like, "It just got worse." Um, and so when you have a body of people who live in a certain area, and then you have people who have political power all across the country who've never encountered one of these people, who,
Yeah.
like you said earlier, only sees them getting arrested, only sees them go into prison for tax evasion, Wesley Snipes,
Yeah.
and so on. Then they're going to have an image of that whole body of. So for one, they're all going to lump them together, and like that's one of the like every time there's a guy with a rifle at a school, it's always like, oh, this was a troubled soul, and people said that he was great. But if there's a shooting in Chicago or Baltimore, it's, well, they're at it again.
Yeah.
And so part of white privilege is being an individual.
Yeah. When I wrote my first thesis, one of the things I did was I went to newspapers.com and I just typed in a search and I said, give me, I narrowed my search from 1942 to 1945. And I just did a search for soldier and sailor. When I do that search, I get, over 1 million results. And those results are stories about, this soldier gave candy to some kids in some village in France. This soldier done good because he did this thing in the war, right? Hometown boy does good, right? On and on and on, all throughout, right? So then I go in and I type in Negro soldier and Negro sailor. And what I get, overwhelming, is stories about Black troops committed a crime, involved in riot, arrested for this, arrested for that. On and on and on and on. The only place you find those kind of feel good, Johnny done good type of stories is in the Black newspaper during that time frame, right? The white newspapers, the mainstream newspapers, are only publishing negative stories almost without exception. I think I found in the first 100 results, I found like 2 or 3 in mainstream papers, right? And that's kind of like this paradigm that's like established of this, this presentation. But also we have to note that like seeks like, right? And so de facto segregation continues after the end of de jure segregation, of segregation in law, because of a lot of pushback and gerrymandering, but also
and redlining.
Absolutely, but also because it continues throughout, because ultimately what you end up having is initially some movement where some people of color are going into these neighborhoods. And you have a couple of things happening. One, you have them going into these neighborhoods and they're not welcome. So they're like, well, to hell with this. I'm going back to a place where people look like me, right? Because they're not feeling welcome, right? And then also you have this movement where there's gentrification, right? Where formerly POC neighborhoods are being gentrified and then turned into these upscale neighborhoods that the POC can no longer afford. So they're heading for other environs, right? They're being clustered into places they can afford, which is forcing them into particular areas. So now we have these elements of systemic segregation, right, coming into play as well, where it is in some ways, actually, in some ways and in some places, between all of these different elements, made the segregation in some ways and in some places worse than it was in some parts of the country under legalized segregation in the South, you know.
And this is demographics are also why we need to make sure we stress to upcoming generations that people vote, land does not. Because yes, cities are overwhelmingly blue, not because, and they pull a lot of weight, because a lot of people live in a city, whereas like, thank you, Gilmore, whereas like 500 people lived in my hometown. And yes, they all might have voted Republican, because they did, because I grew up at the town where Joe Exotic was a cop.
Yeah.
But those 500 people don't hold a candle to the 100,000 medium-sized town just down the road.
And in discussions with my dad, then I went and then looked it up, because always go look up things.
And not on ChatGTP.
Right.
And verify.
And so in talking to him about segregation, he said what they did was they took black schools with black teachers that cared about their black students, closed them down, and then stuffed those black kids into the back of classrooms with white teachers, with white students who didn't want them there, and white teachers who didn't want to teach them. And it, you know, it's the same thing with like the integration of pools. Like the whole running gag of black people can't swim is rather than integrate the pools, and I was talking to someone about this not too long ago, but rather than integrate the pools, they filled them up with cement and closed down the pool, which is why, one, you know, there's the theme of black people can't swim because they didn't have places to bring their kids to learn how to swim. I learned how to swim at a pool. My niece and nephew learned how to swim at a pool. None of us went out to the ocean and tried to figure it out there. We had like trained teachers teach us how to and then rather than a civic facility that serviced multiple communities and was a part of the fabric of American life 100 years ago, and even like 70 years ago, that went away because of the fallout of racism. And so now, if you want to go to a pool, 9 times out of 10, you're going to a gym that you have to pay a membership for.
Rex says, and how they knock down middle-class black neighborhoods to build highways. Even worse, go look up how many black towns are underneath man-made lakes.
Look, if you watch the show Lessons in Chemistry with Brie Larson, there's a subplot because the neighborhood that her character is living in is a predominantly black neighborhood. Los Angeles is to this day, where they and one of the subplots of that show is the black people in that neighborhood fighting the 10 freeway, Interstate 10, coming through their neighborhood. And I was like, hey, what the heck? Because where I grew up, my grandmother's house is literally 1 block south of I-10. So, you know, my mother, I was like, hey, have you checked this show? She was like, oh yeah, we used to go down, even though we weren't supposed to, we used to go down to the construction zone where they were building, and that's where we would go play, you know, as they were building that through. So yes, literally, they built that right there through my grandmother's neighborhood, and obviously had to tear down a lot of homes of black people running right through there. Just, you know, progress, right? You know.
So two things. One, the 10 to this day segregates the city.
Yes.
Like people in LA talk about going south of the 10.
Yes.
And south of the 10 is people who look like us, people who have a Latino background, and so on. And then
Yep.
north is people who don't. But
Yeah.
Who look
the
like
other
me.
thing is, pull up a picture of the interstate highways in the United States and like pay particular care to like places like Chicago, Florida, California, and you'll see that like the 10 is a great example because the 10 runs like this, like it's straight, and then it hits parts where it's like,
Yep.
And that's because they had to run it all over the black people.
Yeah. Yeah. Why? So of course we build the interstate system originally and starts getting built in the 1950s because we're in the height of the Cold War, right? And we need a interconnected, federally maintained highway system to be able to move troops and material in the event we end up in a shooting, right? And so, yeah, we're going to pave these over these very particular places. And run them in a very particular way. And yeah, quite literally, if you go on the internet and you can look up a place in Los Angeles called the South Seas House. The South Seas House sits 1 block south of I-10 on Arlington. And that was the house next door to that. There were only 2 houses on that side of the block. The South Seas House, which is a very famous house. It's now owned by the city. That sits right next, and it's got this very kind of sweeping because it looks like a South Seas kind of bungalow thing. The house right next door to that, the only other house on that side of the block was my grandmother's house.
Wow.
That my grandfather bought after World War II. And
I knew it was in Adams.
Yeah, it's Adams. Yeah. Literally, if you go, there's the show. What's the name of that show? The one that was on HBO about the mortuary.
Not pushing daisies.
No,
the other one.
the really depressing one.
Yeah. But anyway, the exteriors. That's the next block south that they shot.
6 feet under. Thank you, Kato.
6 feet under. Yes, 6 feet under. That's the next block south of my my grandmother's house where I grew up. That house sits like 1 block south. But yeah, my grandfather, he got out, and my grandfather was something of he was a hustler. He played dice and cards and stuff like that. Had incredible luck and skill at pool and other things, and would routinely make a lot of money. He loved taking money off of white officers during the war. And he went to work. He spent a year just playing horses and stuff like that after he got out. And he had enough money. He put a down payment on the house, bought a new car, and went to work for the post office. And no lie, my grandfather would get stopped by the LAPD every single day on his way to work because he had a new car. He was a black man in a new car in Los Angeles. And so he would get stopped every day on his way to work. And it wasn't until finally the postmaster at his branch got on him and said, "Hey, why are you late all the time?" And he said, "Because the cops stopped me on my way to work every day." And it was only because the white postmaster at his branch called down to the LAPD and said, "Hey, this guy works for me at the post office. He delivers the United States mail. Lay off." And that was the only reason he no longer got stopped every day on his way to work.
Well, this has been amazing. The Lurking Writer System from the UK. This won't surprise anyone, but I've learned more about American history in the last 90 minutes than I probably did in the last 20 years. It's amazing what happens when you get a historian on your show. And I would love to talk for another 2 hours, but we should probably look at wrapping it up soon-ish.
You know, if you ever work up the courage to have me on again, I'd be more than happy to.
Oh, you'll be
You
back.
tell us. You tell
You'll be
us
back.
when you want to come on, right? Like this has been a treat.
Well, thank
I
you
do
so much.
have one more TTRPG related question for you.
Yes.
So earlier you mentioned newspapers.com. Even earlier you talked about how you went to the early issues of where did you find these issues for your research? Because I want to know where they kept these things.
Actually, you could go onto the Internet Archive and find every issue of Dragon Man.
Wow.
Yeah, they're all on Internet Archive. Every single issue is on there.
If I had money, I would donate it to Internet Archive because
that
just
type
stuff is
Internet.
so important.
Yeah, type Internet Archive Dragon Magazine, and they're all right there. Every single issue. Yeah, and that's what I did. I just went in to the Internet Archive and I was like, what the hell? I like stumbled on it and I was like, what the hell? Just page through. Like I said, I went through every single issue in the first 10 years of Dragon Magazine.
That's crazy.
Yeah. So yeah, that was a fun time. But I love research. Like I wrote my
as a historian, I hope you do. If
I wrote
you
my
didn't like research, your life would be really difficult.
It would be really difficult. Yeah, I wrote one of my it was actually my senior thesis for my undergrad. I wrote and I did a short documentary about the full-fledged film studio that used to be here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. In the middle of the early to mid 20th century, it was the largest maker of commercial film clips in the world, and also, coincidentally, briefly in the 1920s, the largest manufacturer of private aircraft. Used to exist right here in Colorado Springs, and I spent like an entire summer in an archive pouring through box after box. But I'm a history nerd, so like to me that's exciting.
Well, amazing. Thank you again for coming on, for sharing your knowledge, and for being so incredibly entertaining while doing it.
Oh, I try to be. Oh, one thing I should note, I want to just throw out there that I'm going to be at Gen Con.
Yes, that was going to be my next thing is what can we promote? Where can we find you?
Yeah, so I will be at Gen Con. I am starting, my plan is to start shooting a series of mini documentaries on marginalized experiences at conventions and in TTRPG spaces. And I'm going to try and kick that off here at Gen Con. So I will be at Gen Con here in a couple of weeks. So look for me there. And if anyone here is going to be attending Gen Con or knows anyone who's at Gen Con, and they want to talk to me on camera about their experiences, I am looking forward to meeting people. But if you want to talk to me just off camera and just chew the fat about games and whatever, history, whatever, I'm also happy to do that too. So yeah, look for me there. Otherwise, you can find me on Twitter at UmbralKnightX. I have a Blue Sky account, but I don't check it very often. Sometimes I do. Same thing, UmbralKnightX over there as well. And yeah, so yeah, keep your eyes peeled. You'll see me. Hopefully I'll get this documentary thing rolling, and interested, I think, to see, based on what I wrote on early and then my other studies, I'm kind of interested to see. I see all of the stuff going on in TTRPG circles, and I kind of try and keep my ear to the ground, but I want to be able to, come at this from an academic perspective and see where marginalized groups are in the spaces now, and kind of get some firsthand experiences and some firsthand accounts of what people are experiencing, seeing, feeling. Yeah. So there.
Yeah, DC says he hopes to say hi to you at Gen Con. And
awesome.
I do believe that Candace will be there. So you should
I will
if the stars align.
I will actually be in a actual play on Gen Con TV that Candace invited me to play in on Friday night. on Gen Con TV. So keep your eyes peeled for that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and chat is just overflowing. We got Lurking Writer and Kato both thanking you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience. Like, this really has been an incredible discussion. And, you know, we talk a lot about how allyship is not a destination. You don't get there.
Yes.
It is taking a step every day to learn a little bit more, to be a little bit better, to be a little bit more aware. And David and I both stress, like, you don't get to proclaim yourself an ally.
Yes.
That is a title that is bequeathed upon you. And you become that by having these talks. Yes.
You're going to mess up too. I'm just going to say that. I mess up all the time. You're going to mess up, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's how you handle that when you mess up, and how you move on from that. Because
absolutely,
look, I say it all the time: progress, not perfection.
Exactly. And if every day you're just 5% better, 5% more knowledgeable,
that
5% adds up so much over time. You're never going to hit 100%. That's the hardest part. Especially the world we live in, where everything's changing. You're never going to hit 100%. Always have to be aware that you will mess up. As Mark J says, like, the list of the people we trust is written in pencil.
Yes. 100%.
Right?
100%.
It's not how many times you fall, it's how many times you get back up. Exactly, Lurking Writer.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So look for Stefan on Twitter. Look for him at Gen Con. And, hey, maybe back here on this channel. Hopefully, we would be so lucky to have you back again.
If I have to come to Colorado Springs and find you.
Oh, yeah. No. This will have to happen again. This is a great time, and there's so many other things we can talk about.
Absolutely. And we did not, we planned your coming on months in advance. I think you were more than 1 month in advance. We did not expect multiple major historical upheavals right before. We didn't even get to most of those.
Right.
So, gosh. We were.
Oh, goodness.
But before we go down that rabbit trail, David, who the heck are you, and what the heck is we doing here?
I am excited to have Stefan back again. But I'm David, and this is the Chaotic Wholesome Presents Table Talk Show, where every week we talk about TTRPG stuff, how to be a better GM, how to be a better player, how to be a better person, all with a focus on intersectionality and inclusivity so that everybody can have a good time.
And you can find us here every Tuesday doing this. Next week, we will be here with Fiona of What Are We Rolling? Which is a great podcast AP, and we hope to see you there. And Thursday, Friday, we're playing Baldur's Gate 3. It's our first playthrough. We are in Act 3. We've been told we're maybe halfway through the game.
Right.
And we are playing
we're in the
our
final
characters
act halfway through the game.
Yes.
Conversations to be had about that game.
Oh yeah, I got some opinions, good and bad.
Yeah, but ditto.
And I've got other stuff that I'm working on, but I can't talk about yet. We always know how that goes. But this is Gilmore. He has been our third co-host. He thanks you for being here as well. You all are wonderful. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Herb and Eugenio for the raids. We so appreciate you. And we are going to raid over to someone. I'm leaving that in David's hands. But we will see you all next time. Thank you again for joining us. Don't forget, we have a Discord where we don't have quite this level of in-depth conversation. But if you want to have cool TTRPG talks, please feel free to join us. We're also hopefully getting ready to gear up to do some more play testing. Maybe we'll see if my raccoon-filled brain will let me get there. But thank you all. You are wonderful. Be kind to yourself. Be excellent to each other. And we will see you next time.
Okay.